Oh, greetings, everybody. Welcome.
Oh,
So pleased to be spending this time with you this morning or this afternoon. I see a lot of old friends. Maybe some of you have never been to one of these programs or have just barely heard of Hazrat Inayat Khan. And then looking around, I see there's many here who have studied his teachings for over 50 years. We have a wonderful group, a variety of experience with meeting what we'll call Murshid, Hazrat Inayat Khan. Primarily, I'm going to be asking Sharif, a dear old friend, some questions. And I must admit that I've never had the function of being an interviewer before. So I need your help. And I have a few questions, and I've asked a few friends what kind of questions they're interested in asking. And so there'll be a chat box open that you can also chat your questions in, and Gopidan will kind of be collecting them and sorting them, and hopefully we will get to many of those in the second part of this program. So before I, let's say, turn it over to Sharif, let me just say how this program came about. I was taking a walk up on my hill one day, some months back, and something deep in my heart wanted to, I'm not sure how I would explain it, connect with another lover of this teaching, of Murshid's teaching. I don't know if you've ever gotten together and shared your love with somebody of your favorite poem or a painting, and the joy of discussing what you love with another lover, another appreciator. And I was so, I could say, high after that talk. I was up on the hill, I was on my cell phone, it was kind of windy. And I would say, well, what do you think about this? Or how do you think Murshid would be today? Or, what is your favorite teaching? And what do you think about this? And I thought, well, wouldn't this be wonderful to share this kind of conversation with others? So that's how it came. So I invited Sharif, and he said, sure, he's more than happy to speak about Murshid. And so the way it's going to work today is, in just a minute, I'll be turning this over to Sharif, and he'll go over some of the aspects of Murshid's historical life. He's in a very, let's say, he's had a life mission which enabled him to study deeply the teachings and lectures of Hazrat Inayat Khan, as he was the archivist for this material and the editor-in-chief of the complete works of Hazrat Inayat Khan, the brown volume. So he's deeply steeped in the original words, the original lectures. I think we know that any teaching that is an expression of the eternal truth, the perennial wisdom, that is, you could say, it's always the same. Reality doesn't change. Reality is reality. but the wisdom throughout time needs to be reformatted in the current, as Murshid said, the current coin, the expressions, the problems of the day, the ways we speak, the evolution of our understanding of through science. So not only does the perennial wisdom have to be reformatted and updated in its expression, not in its essence, to really understand the essence of a teaching, it has to be engaged with, it has to be lived, it has to be practiced. We can't just repeat a teacher's words. That doesn't carry the essence. It needs to be lived and integrated and chewed on, and it has to hold up during our lifetime of all the different changes we go through as individuals. So we might have 50 years ago, when Sharif and I first met, that was over 50 years ago. We met in Paradise, by the way. That's a town in Arizona, but he can tell you about that. So for over 50 years, Sharif was just recently turned 80, and I'll be 80 next year. This is a decades of interest in this teaching, fascination, inspiration. So my understanding, Sharif's understanding, your understanding, many of you here, a number of you here have been engaged in the same love for decades. And how it was when we started, what we thought it was, who we thought Murshid was. As time goes on and we change and we ripen, we have it all figured out when we're young. So this is the work of all of us to digest as much as possible from this teaching that we're so blessed to receive. When I asked Sharif the name of the program, he immediately popped out with Encountering Murshid. So I'll let him speak about that, his encounter, our encounter, an encounter. And I'll only just say very briefly, my encounter was in 1967, when my then husband, Mansour, and I walked into a tiny little apartment room in San Francisco. It was the apartment of Murshid Samuel L. Lewis. And there were maybe 10 of us. Oh, I think I'm gonna start crying as I remember that. So impactful. I'm sure you have your own deep moment of connecting. But there was Sam Lewis reading out of an orange volume. It sounded good to me. I was interested. Yet I was embedded in the conditioned mind, my conditioned from my childhood, my hopes and dreams. And yet in that darkened place, something about those words, simple words from the orange volume, somehow at some level touched me. And that was in 1967. And I've been following, studying ever since. And Sharif and I are not experts in any way. Sharif has a unique life story of having the privilege and the honor and the task of diving deeply into the archives. So he has a really special, in my opinion, view of Murshid and can tell us things about his life, Murshid coming to the West, that most of us aren't aware of. But each of us is an expert on how Murshid lives in our heart. And he may say things that are based on his framework for studying Murshid. I'll say things that are based on my past and my framework. But remember, these are both frameworks. So in that spirit, I'll turn this over to Sharif, my esteemed dear friend.
Thank you so very much. I want to say, I can't tell you how much I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you about Murshid. There's no of greater interest to me, one that I feel more strongly about, and the opportunities to speak to a group of people about him are few and far between. Not that many people in the world are interested in hearing about it. So this is a great opportunity for me, and I appreciate it very much. I'd like to begin by talking about just my own encounter with Murshid. I thought the word encounter was appropriate because there are some beings that you meet, you may have an exchange with. It may make a great impression on you, or it may fade. But there are a few beings in life that you encounter, and that encounter resonates through your life and continues to reverberate for the rest of your life. And that certainly is what happened in this case. In 1970, I went to a New Age meditation camp in Paradise, Arizona, in the Chiricahua Mountains, where Cochise used to live. And there I encountered Pir Vilayat for the first time. And I became an initiate. That's a whole story in itself, but that's for a different occasion. But I started going to classes in Tucson. Murshid Sam sent a man named Abdurrahman Lomax to be the leader in the new Tucson Center. And in those, there would be readings. In those days, Pir Vilayat never mentioned anything about his father during the camp that I went to and where I was initiated. But there were these readings, and eventually I listened to them carefully, and I finally inquired, well, where did those come from? And Abdurrahman told me, well, they came from Hazrat Inayat Khan, Pir Vilayat's father. And so I got interested in that and started reading. I got one or two of the orange volumes, and I got more and more interested. But then a few years later, it was actually in 1977, I was at by that time I was a leader myself. Pir Vilayat had made me a leader, and I was at a leaders camp. He used to give camps just for people who were in leadership positions. And he gave a talk where he said, you know, people come to me and they say, I met him. They say, I saw Murshid. I've encountered Murshid. And I thought, wow, that's really quite amazing, because of course he died in 1927. And Pir Vilayat sent us out to meditate and to concentrate on this idea of actually meeting Murshid. I'd meditated, and I actually had I was out sitting on a rock there at the abode, and I had a visionary experience. I was just sitting there with my eyes closed, and I saw there was a gate in front of me. I didn't recognize it at all. I'd never been to Europe. Well, I'd been to Europe, but I'd never been to Suran, never seen Fazl Manzil or any of that. Later on, I recognized it as the gate to Fazl Manzil. Those of you who've been there will remember that there's a high wall around it, and there's a gate that you come out of. But I didn't know what gate it was. But the gate opened, and this very dignified man stepped out of the gate, saw me standing there, and nodded to indicate that I could come and join him. So I did. I went and joined him. We started walking along the sidewalk for quite a long time, and I had an overwhelming impression that I was walking with a king on his way to his coronation. The people in Suren actually called Murshid le roi, king. They thought he was a king of something, they didn't know what, but he had that dignity, that majesty in his presence. So we walked along, we didn't say anything. And we arrived at another gate. And he turned to me and indicated without words that he was going through this gate and this was a place I couldn't come with him. I was looking at him and I noticed the little curls of his hair along by his beard there. And I had this very strange wish to run my fingers through those curls. He looked at me and he said, "You can." So I took my fingers and put them through the curls on the side of his face. And he looked at me and he said, "You see, you are my very own." And then he turned and went through the gate and closed. That was my encounter with Murshid, my first encounter. You know that the title by which we call Murshid, it wasn't used during his lifetime, as far as we know, Hazrat. It means literally presence. And it means a person whose presence is still available, even though they have gone to the other side, somewhere else. Still his presence. And Murshid's presence is very much available. I can attest to this because I've experienced it many times in many situations. I don't have many visionary experiences like the one that I just told you about, but I have felt his presence very, very often. It is definitely available. All right, so Taj, would you like me now to give a kind of summary of Murshid's life and career? Is that the next thing on the agenda?
Could you say a little bit about your work in the archives and how you came to know so much about this history?
Yes. Well, I was asked because I have a very strong academic background. I've worked as an editor, a scholarly editor. I was asked from a very early time to begin working on the works of Inayat Khan for Sufi Order publications. We were publishing, republishing various books. And I constantly asked people, well, where are the originals of these texts? Because I could tell they'd been edited. I could tell they'd been quite edited. That's not hard to tell if you're an experienced editor. And nobody knew. But then finally, when we were getting ready for the centenary celebrations in 1982, the 100th year of Murshid's birth, Sikandar Kopelman, who was the Pirbalite secretary in those days, went to Suren and was working on making the arrangements. And he went to a little archive across the street and met a woman there. He said, "I found out where those originals are." And I said, "Oh, really? Well, where?" And she said, "Well, it's a little house across the street from Fazl Manzil. And there's a woman there. It turned out her name was Munira. And at that time, my name was Munir. Munira van Voorst van Beest was her name. And she was in charge of the archive and was putting together things. And he said, they've got everything there, but let me tell you, you're not going to get your hands on anything from there." So the next year, when I went to Suren for the centenary celebrations, I went to I was expecting this kind of dragon lady to meet, and she turned out to be the most gracious, welcoming, wonderfully warm person that I've ever known. Munira was just a complete delight, welcomed me in and took me into the work. Well, she was already engaged in the first volume of what became the complete works. And I began working on it. I went back every summer. I was a professor, so I had 3 months off every summer. I went back and worked intensively there. And then finally, after she died, I retired from my professorship and moved there full time and worked on it. So, working on this is a scholarly edition of the works of Inayat Khan, which was necessary because the texts that in the Sufi message volumes and other places have been very highly edited. They're not reliably very close to what Murshid said. They've been changed in a lot of ways. So the job, this is a scholarly edition, so we had to compare all the manuscripts, beginning with, as Murshid spoke from 1922 on, as he spoke, everything he said was taken down meticulously in short. Sakina Fournay, his Dutch secretary, who spoke English perfectly, she wrote everything down in shorthand. So, and we have those records. So we have a record of exactly what he said. She had transcribed all of those into regular written English and sent the transcriptions to Murshid Goodenough, who was Murshid's editor, wonderful editor. But she then edited them and published them in various kinds of books, and then apparently discarded them. No one knows what happened to those. So we had to, first of all, make new transcriptions. Munira taught herself the shorthand that Sakina had used, very esoteric Dutch form of shorthand for English, and we had to retranscribe everything. So that formed the basis, the transcription from what Murshid was actually speaking. And then all of the other manuscripts, versions of those talks, which sometimes was as many as 12 different versions. We did not include the Sufi message volumes, for example, which were edited so extensively that there's no point in comparing them to the original. You can do that yourself and you'll find it quite amazing how many changes have been made. But in any case, what that meant was you take the transcription from the shorthand and you compare it to each one of these other manuscripts, word for word, making a note of every change, which then appears in a footnote. So that meant I would spend the better part of a week going through a manuscript, comparing it word for word for word for word, 12 times in some cases. Let me tell you, you get to know a talk very, very well by the time you've gone through comparing it word for word a dozen times. And I invariably found that I discovered something in the talk that I hadn't noticed at all the first time through. Something completely new emerged. And the other very mysterious thing that seemed to happen was that whatever it was that I was working on seemed to have a personal message for me at that moment in my life. I can't explain how that could possibly be the case. A talk that was given, 70 years ago to a completely different audience would have a message, personal message for me. But it happened over and over again. I became quite used to it. The complete works that I was working on presents all of Murshid's teachings in strictly chronological order. And I worked on them in chronological order. That means that during the summer school in Suren, which lasted for 2.5, almost 3 months every summer, Murshid would sometimes give 5 different talks on the same day on different subjects. One would be a general talk to the public, another would be a class for higher initiates, another would be a class for shirags, another one might be a talk for the brotherhood, that is the social kataka, as we call them. All these different kinds of talks that he would give, sometimes 5 in one day. Well, when he would give 5 talks in one day, and I would work on them one after the other by this meticulous method, not only would I discover things in the text that I'd never noticed before, but I could see what Murshid was thinking about that day, because the same themes would appear in these talks to different groups. And this is really quite amazing. I mean, I don't have any way of knowing what I was thinking on a particular day in the past, or anybody else. But here I could see exactly what Murshid was thinking on a particular day in a particular summer, over and over again. I could follow the development, the course of his thought from day to day. And that was really, I must say, an amazing experience, and one by which I came to know his thinking intimately, in a way that there would be no other possible way of gaining access to someone's thinking in that way. So that was my joy and privilege in working on the complete works. Did that give you a good idea, Todd?
Yes, thank you, Sharif. And before you go on to speak about Murshid's life,
Yeah.
I want to just personally say my heart is so moved right now, because it not only, again, just hearing about that work, but knowing that you and others before you and those transcribers, all of what's gone behind the scenes to offer us this teaching. And it shows how, well, I don't need to say more, but I really thank you. Our lives are brief here on earth, and we, and what you've given is so precious. And I really want to honor your life for that. Sometimes in my days of despair, and I think that the world is going to come to a very bad diminishment, and there will only be a few people left. I think, well, the archives are there, and a new civilization can spring forth from this wisdom.
Yes, well, I understand that very well. And I was a professor of religious studies. I studied all the different religions and scriptures, and very extensively, and I became aware of how extremely important it is to preserve the original form of each inspiration. I mean, what would we give to know really for sure exactly what Jesus said? We can't, of course, for various reasons, but we can get closer. But in this case, we know exactly what Murshid said, and we can preserve it. And when I discovered, some people thought, well, so what? These texts are edited; they're good enough. The message comes across. But being a scholar and being dedicated to this idea of preserving the original and for forever, as far as that's possible, I knew that we had to do this in a very serious way. Then when I discovered the various things that Murshid himself said, well, I'll just quote one of them, which is the one that got to me the strongest. If you will preserve my words, it will be like saving my life. Now, if I had a chance to save Murshid's life, of course, I would do anything. And sitting there in the archive, going over these texts over and over again, if that was preserving his life, then I was certainly willing to do that. So, did you want me to answer other questions, or do you want me to give a short version of his life at this point?
Yeah, why don't you give us, what is it, the 10-minute version rather than the three day? Okay.
Right. I had a dear friend, Don Lohr was his name, and if you would ask him a question about anything, he knew about all kinds of things, and he'd say, well, do you want the 1-minute answer or the 10-minute answer, or do you want the complete answer, which would take a few days? So I'd like to give you the 10-minute version of Murshid's life. It's not nearly enough because there are so many details, but I'm going to try to do it in 10 minutes because God tells me there are some people perhaps on this call don't know anything about Murshid's life. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of his life, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. They're being gathered, and they will be sent to Taj and passed on to me at some point. So here, let me begin. Murshid was born in a city called Baroda, or Vadodara, it's called now, Baroda in Gujarat. in Western India in 1882, July 5th, 1882. He was born into a very distinguished family, musical family. His grandfather was a man named Mullah Bash, a master of blessing, who founded a great music school called the Gayan Shala that is still there, and had a great influence on the development of Indian music. And this is the family that he grew up in. His father was a musician and was in this school as well. Rama Khan was his name. His mother came from a very distinguished background and was one of the daughters of Mullah Bash. He grew up really in the atmosphere of his grandfather primarily. He used to, even as a very young man, like to sit in the corner. His grandfather had people visiting from all over India, poets and philosophers, representatives of various religions. He actually had a great interest in things Hindu, although he was Muslim theoretically, let's say. It was a Muslim family, but one that was very open. For example, when it came time for little Inayat to go to school, they sent him not to a Muslim school, but to a Hindu school because it was a better school. Now, this would never happen in India today. Things have become very divided now. But in those days, well, he was a student. Little Inayat wrote a hymn to Krishna. Muslim boys do not write hymns to Krishna now. It was a very open atmosphere that he grew up in. He was a very, very bright. He was the first son, very, very bright boy, but also a very, very naughty boy. He was always doing things that upset his very dedicated parents. He ran away from home more than once. He did all kinds of play that was not considered appropriate. He was when he went to school, he refused to study anything he wasn't interested in, and that included anything involving mathematics. For example, he didn't like mathematics and he didn't study it. He didn't learn it. He never learned it. All through his life, he couldn't handle money because he didn't know basic mathematics. Somebody had to do that for him, but he just wasn't interested. He was interested in literary things that he loved very much, and anything involving music. So he grew up being very creative, but also somewhat distressing to the people who were concerned about making sure he had a good career and all of those things. But very early on, he began to be a teacher in his grandfather's school. He would go in, the professors, he would offer to take over their classes for them, which they readily agreed to. Well, they got to go off and do whatever they wanted. Well, he took over the classes. He started teaching more and more classes, and already when he was in his mid-teens. And then in his later teens, he decided it was time to travel around India. He was a brilliant musician. He played the veena, the instrument of Shiva, actually, and he sang in the Drupad style. You may be familiar with some of that from the Dagar brothers, for example, or other examples. A very, very beautiful kind of singing. And in those days, in order to establish a reputation as a musician, you had to enter competitions in the courts of the various Maharajas. So he traveled around India, Madras, and well, a lot of different places he went. He even went to Sri Lanka and entered competitions and almost always won them. He got a whole series of gold medals. You may have seen a photograph of him with about a dozen gold medals on his breastplate there that he won. He later lost the medals in Calcutta, but anyway, he won all these competitions. They were real gold medals. They were worth something, but they also indicated a great musical ability, which was recognized very widely. And then finally, he went to the court in Hyderabad. The Nizam of Hyderabad. Hyderabad was an independent kingdom. It never was part of the British Raj. Actually, when India became independent in 1947, 48, they had to conquer Hyderabad to make it part of India. The Nizam, the ruler, refused to be a part of India. They had to fight a war and conquer it. But anyway, this Nizam was reputed to be the richest man in the world. They had fabulous jewels from a place called Golconda, which is just right outside of Hyderabad. This was the most brilliant court, and so being able to win a competition there would have assured his great. He went there. Everyone said, "Oh no, it's impossible. You can't possibly see the Nizam." Well, it happened. I won't go into the details. It's all fascinating, but he got to sing for the Nizam. The Nizam was so moved by the singing that he stood up. Meant everyone else in the court had to stand up, of course, with the Nizam. He took an emerald ring off of his finger and put it on Inayat's finger and named him Tansen of India. Tansen, the great singer in the court of the Emperor Akbar. It's kind of like the Nobel Prize for Tansen of India. And that was the peak of his musical career. There was nothing higher that you could achieve. But also, while he was there in Hyderabad, he came to know he was looking for someone to guide him. His family had been Sufi Murids, of course, but he was looking for someone to guide him, and he got introduced to a man named Abu Hashim Madani, who became his guide. And it's a wonderful story. I want to tell you all the stories, but I can't. Who guided him then for more than 3 years. He went to see his Murshid every day, and his Murshid taught him many, many things. He guided him into what is called four-school Sufism. That is to say, all of the four major schools of Sufism, all of their practices and so forth. And then late in 1907, his Murshid, who was already an elderly man, he died, but he gave, before he died, a commission to Inayat. He said, "Fare forth into the world, my child, and unite East and West in your music. For to this end you are gifted by Allah, the Merciful." Was his commission. He didn't tell him to go to the West. He said, "Fare forth into the world and unite East and West." Well, once his Murshid had died, you would think he would go right away, but he didn't, because his father was still alive. And it would have been considered wrong for him to do that. His mother had died, but his father was still alive. And so, but he did not return to Baroda. He could have gone back to Baroda. He could have worked at the Gayanchala. He could have become the head of the Gayanchala very easily. He didn't do that. He went to Calcutta, and he worked on starting a school there. He had a lot of offers from various Maharajas in Bengal for positions in their court, but he wouldn't accept any subservient position. He got quite a bit of help from the Tagore family, Rabindranath Tagore, the great poet who was the first Asian to win the Nobel Prize. He knew that family, which was a very, very distinguished family in Calcutta, and worked on trying to develop a school, but it didn't quite work out. In the end, after his father died, he went back. He gathered one of his brothers and his cousin, and he went and took a ship in 1910 to America. The ship landed in New York City, and there they were. I'm taking more time than I have to do this, so I'm going to hurry up now. In New York City, they knew no one. It was going the other side of the world. It's astounding bravery on his part, if that's the right word, self-confidence. They got connected up the wonderful dancer, and were engaged. She was doing Indian dances and needed Indian music to accompany her, Ruth St. Denis. And so they got connected with Ruth St. Denis by an impresario and traveled across the country from New York to San Francisco. There parted company with Ruth St. Denis because she wanted to be certified as an Indian dancer. And Inayat Khan, who was a person of extreme integrity, said, well, your dances are very wonderful, but they're not Indian dances. I can't do that. And so that was the end. They were slated. There in San Francisco, he gave some lectures about Indian music. And at one of those, a woman named Rabia Martin, Ada Martin, came and wrote to him afterwards and came and met him and became his first initiate in the West, Murshid, Rabia Martin. They were slated then to have a musical tour of their own, but the impresario who had arranged everything was on the Titanic and didn't make it back to New York. They went back to New York. There was a man named Pierre Bernard who had started a yoga school there in New York City. He was asked to give musical performances and lessons there. Did so. One of his pupils was Pierre Bernard's younger half-sister, Aura Ray Baker. They fell in love. The love was forbidden by her half-brother. Murshid went on to England. He had been slated to do. She followed him some months later. Once they were reunited in London, they got married. He then had been invited to go to Russia. He went to Moscow, and their first child was born there in Moscow. And well, things got he was planning to go back to India from there, but things got very touchy politically. Of course, the First World War was about to break out, so they had to go to France and ultimately England. He spent the war in England and then gathered a group of Marids around him. Once the war was over, a couple of years afterwards, he moved to France, where he had gotten a very good reception to his music and lived in France for the rest of his life, settling finally in a splendid house in Suresnes, given to them by a Dutch Marid, Murshid Fazlmai, and Fazl Manzil is the house, and gave his teachings, traveled very widely. He went back to America twice, in 1923 for a tour, and then in 1926 for a longer tour. He gave his summer schools there in Suresnes and many, many teachings. He traveled all kinds of other places. And then finally, after his last summer school, what turned out to be his last summer school and the dedication of the Universelle, he finally got back to India for the first time, the end of 1926. In January of 26, he became quite ill. He was accompanied by a Dutch woman named Kismet Stam, one of his secretaries. He went to many doctors. They rented a lodge called Tilak Lodge in Delhi, and he died there from, it says, pneumonia on his death certificate on the 5th of February, 1927, age 44. So it was longer than it should have been, I'm sorry, but that's just a general view of his life. So now I'm sure there are lots of questions.
Thank you, Sharif. Let's take a breath here. Just to digest and take in the picture that you've painted for us, and that all of this teaching that we're so appreciative of was given in such a short amount of time. And the fact that he died when he was 44 and gave
Yes. Yeah.
so much on so many different subjects is just astounding.
It is quite amazing, the volume of teaching that came in, and he didn't really start teaching until 1915. So it was all 10 or 11 years. And the teaching is all transcriptions from talks that he gave. He didn't write teachings. After his first book, Sufi Message of Spiritual Liberty, he didn't write anymore. He just gave talks.
So I've gathered a few questions. There's a number of them about relating to your work at the archives. On this, on the walk up on the hill with Sharif, I remember one of the questions that I was asking him, which was, from all of your study and practice and poring over these words and lectures, what for you would be one of the most central, important teachings that Murshid had that is relevant for us? And he's going to share that a little bit later, not quite yet. He wanted to read a paper actually from Murshid. But before we do that, I want to just name some of the types of questions that are coming in. And then we'll return to them. For example, dear Sharif, being so intimate with Murshid's thinking on a day-to-day level, it is a precious gift for us all. Is there one thing from your studies about his daily thinking that would be good for us to know? Similarly, is there one surprise from all your editing experience that you could share? A surprising difference from what was edited before? The questions that people had asked me, this is a kind of a number of people mentioned something like this. The cry of humanity and even of the whole of creation seems to have progressed from a cry to a desperate wail. Hazrat Inayat Khan stated that my smallest work in the inner plane is worth more than I do in the outer world. If he were alive today, do you think he would say the same thing? And kind of another way of phrasing that is, the world that we live in seems to be increasingly fragile and frightening to so many people, with the increasing destruction of nature, warfare, hunger, migration, and loss of human rights, due to a large part to the rise of totalitarian politicians and government seeking personal power and wealth. At least on the surface, it seems that the world is becoming, quote, less spiritual. Which of Murshid's teaching might speak directly to our situation today?
You want me to respond to any of these?
Sure. Why don't you, while I'm gathering the other questions? Yeah.
Well, the last one is a very strong question. I think in speaking as a kind of historian, life on Earth has been fragile and precarious for a very, very long time. This is nothing new. And I think Murshid would definitely not hesitate to say still that his work on the inner planes is more important than all he does in the outer world. In fact, doing something in the outer world seems to be becoming, in a way, more and more challenging, because, of course, the conditions on Earth. I'm speaking about the environment, climate change, and all of those things. It seems so far beyond our control. But I have noted that the people who are involved strongly in the battle, who are out there trying to make things better, have more hope than those of us who are just sitting back despairing. And but in order to be involved, you have to be involved from within. This is maybe the most important thing that I learned from Murshid. I mean, well, I'd say there are two things. One is that, I was a very highly educated young man. I went to a magnificent university and I won high honors, and I was very much in my head, shall we say, and I thought that's where it was at. And it was Murshid who taught me that that's the surface, and that the heart is the center of things. I didn't know that before I became deeply involved in Murshid's teaching. So he called Sufism the religion of the heart, being heart-centered, and also understanding that there are thoughts, there are emotions, and then Murshid called it feelings. He thought feelings were much deeper than emotions. And then there's some place that he called, we'll be encountering it in what I'm going to read to you in a little while, the bottom of the heart. There's a place you can go that is the bottom of the heart. And that's really the connecting point between the soul and the rest of us. In the Middle Ages, when they opened dead bodies, which was illegal, they had to do it on the sly, and they cut open the heart, they found it was empty because, of course, the blood was no longer pumping. And they thought that's where the soul lived. You can see pictures of these little eyes looking out through the heart. The soul lived in the heart. Well, in a sense, that's true. In the depths of the heart, the soul lives. That's the point where you can have contact with the soul. Murshid knew this and taught me this. And also the inner life, the importance of the inner life, because we live in a culture where the outer life has become so much emphasized that, well, if you look at people today, their devices. We used to call them phones, but they're devices now. Keep them engaged outwardly all the time. There's no room for the inner life. If there's nothing to do, nothing to engage with, then there's nothing. The inner life, which is where that spiritual life is, the inner life. There's a wonderful book that Murshid dictated on the subject, the inner life. That's the real thing. And I don't think that has changed at all due to the outer circumstance.
Sharif?
My opinion.
Yes, of course. Sharif, how would you describe, or what do you think is unique or additive, or why is this teaching and this message useful in our time? What's the essence that you feel is?
Well, I think there are two things. One is because this is in one of the prayers in Hakim, we say, raise us above the distinctions and differences which divide us. What other message have you ever heard of that asks to be raised above the distinctions and differences which divide us? All the messages I'm familiar with, unfortunately, emphasize increasing those divisions and differences. So here, this is a message where we're asked to rise above that. So that is very important because we live in a world where these divisions are causing terrible chaos. I mean, you only need to think of Ukraine for a moment, and you see what the results are of distinctions and differences.
Excuse me, and Sharif, and
yes.
what would that look like? What does that mean, rise above? How do we do that? What is that?
Well, it means that we come to regard those differences as unimportant. We think of what we have in common as much more important than the things that divide us. In other words, it's a vision of unity, and that's the other aspect of it, because that's what we so desperately need now, is a vision of unity. Humanity as a whole, all of us together, are one, and we're far from realizing this. We have the United Nations, but they're not united. We have even the European Union. I lived there for quite a long time. Believe me, there's no union there. And I'm not talking about England. I'm talking about all the other ones. We need unity, and that's what is behind the one, toward the one. That's the direction that we need to move. The perfection of love, harmony, and beauty. That's the other aspect, of course, of Murshid's message that I think is so essentially important, is the centrality of love.
How would you say a person would go from appreciating these teachings and reading them and, let's say, imbibing their essence in order to actually be transformed by the vision, by the wisdom that's in them? How does one approach the path after encountering Murshid?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's by everything that Murshid taught, if you look at it carefully, implies a practice, implies something that you can do, but that's something you have to discover for yourself, because what is right for you to do is something that only you can know, only you can discover. You can't, no one else can tell you what that is. You have to discover it yourself. And so if you look at any text, any paragraph from Murshid, and you think about it in terms of practice, what can I do in my life to realize this? It will come to you. You can find it, and you can do it. It's one step at a time. You don't need to read, 14 volumes and absorb them all before you can start. If you understand just one thing in the teaching, you can make that into your practice, and you can do that. And when that's fulfilled, then you can go on to another one, one step at a time. It's not really that difficult, as long as you're not trying to do something too big. We all fall into the error of thinking we have to understand everything before we can start doing what will lead us to that goal. We only need to understand the next step.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Very, very practical for that. I've often been asked, I want to know Hazrat Inayat Khan's teaching. I want to know, can you recommend one book or one volume, or this is, I've been asked this so many times. And what would you say to that? What would be a good introduction?
Well, there used to be a little book called The Smiling Forehead that was put out by some press in San Francisco back in the old days that I always recommended. And there were used copies of it somewhere. I mean, it's a kind of a cobbled together little thing, but it was a very good essential. But I don't know if it used to be available on Amazon as a used book. I don't know if it is anymore. The Way of Illumination is a very, very good introduction. I would recommend that to people who would like to start it. It goes through the 10 Sufi thoughts, and those are of endless inspiration. And it's a very interesting thing, the original form Murshid gave originally 7 Sufi teachings, he called it. That was the first form. And second one of those is still my favorite. It was left out of the final list, but it's never to be enslaved by principles. I love that. But the 10, when he made it and expanded it into 10, he no longer called it teachings. He didn't want to be seen as a missionary. He didn't even want to be seen as a teacher. These are Sufi thoughts. And he didn't come to tell you what to do. He came to suggest things to you that might be helpful to you on your path. And that's very that's not the way teachers are. That's not the way gurus are. Even Murshids. That's the way he was. He very strongly said, if there's anything in my teaching that you don't like, just ignore it. Don't pay any attention to it. Just find something that you do like. And this is an attitude that I find really liberating.
Well, isn't that one of the subtitles of the message, a message of spiritual liberty?
Absolutely, spiritual liberty. He already got the essence of it in the title of his first book in the West, yes.
Here's a question. I have taken deeply to heart over the years Murshid's plea to not change his words.
Right.
100 years distance has opened up some minor difficulties with movements towards gender neutral language and modern preferences for elimination of unnecessary connecting words and archaic language. What is your thinking nowadays about this?
Well, the complete works that I was so intimately involved with for 30 years is a scholarly edition, and so it doesn't change anything. We just put down what was originally said. We come as close as we can to what Murshid actually said. I understand that there are some things in his way of speaking 100 years ago that are go against the grain of the present day. I myself don't find it necessary to change the wording of the things that Murshid said. For me, it's all right, but you can say, well, you happen to be a male person, so obviously that it'd be okay with you because that was the dominance in those days. And maybe that's the case. I don't know. I consider myself as much a feminist as a man can be, but it doesn't disturb me. If it disturbs people, then they should do what they need to do. But I'm not in favor of changing things myself, but nobody asks me. So I guess it doesn't make any difference what I'm in favor of.
Here we have, could you speak to the teaching of Hazrat Inayat Khan? What is needed is to be in rhythm with life's condition and in tune with the infinite, and how he addressed the marriage of duality and non-duality.
Yes, well, that's a huge question, of course, a question for all of us, because we live in our consciousness of, well, it's not even duality, it's a lot more than two, it's multivality that we live in, and then hopefully the consciousness of unity somewhere there in the background, which we can pull to the foreground. It's a constant, it's a dance, shall we say. Murshid was a musician above all, although he gave up his music and became a verbal teacher instead in his later years. But he experienced life as music. I'm convinced of this. It was not a metaphor for him. Life is not like music. Life is music. It's a symphony that we're involved in. Sometimes the sounds are incredibly beautiful and inspiring and uplifting. Sometimes they're like a bunch of garbage cans being knocked together. That's life as we experience it. It's our job to find some way of incorporating all this into the reality of our consciousness. And the key to that is to realize that the things that we think are important may not be important at all. And that the fundamental reality of our being is something which is beyond all of that, beneath it, beyond it, in the depths. And if we can learn to live in the depths, than what is happening on the surface. Although it may be interesting, it may be distressing, but it's really not that important.
Thank you. Can you comment on Murshid's use of the words mastery and messenger?
Well, he didn't have any problem with the term mastery or the word master. Nowadays, apparently, for some people, this is a problematical word. Messenger and master are two very different things. A messenger is, well, as it implies, bearing a message that may require a person with a lot of discipline. The great messengers who have brought the divine message to humanity, many of them have been people of extreme discipline, the Buddha, for example, but not necessarily. So they're different things. Master and messenger are two different things, perhaps related. Master just means someone who can do something really, really well. It doesn't, as Murshid uses it, it's not gendered. It doesn't mean a man who can do things well. It just means a person who can do things well. We don't have any special word for a female master. Murshid certainly didn't think of it in gendered terms.
Well, that brings me to the question, Murshid's appreciation for women at a time when we were basically second-class citizens. Can you say anything about how do you think he came to that view, or how did that go over?
I think he saw it in the women in the West. Once he got to the West, of course, women in India were very powerful within their own realm. They had a lot of power, but it was the outward power was in the hands of men. But then when he got to the West, when he met, for example, Rabia Marzin, he met a woman with a great deal of power and recognized her immediately. She was the first Murshida that he made. He not only trained her personally, but he made her a Murshida long before he made any others. But the four people that he gave the 11th initiation of Murshida to were all women. He didn't elevate any men to that stage. And he said when he was traveling in America, he said that he saw very clearly that it was women who would lead humanity to the next steps of its evolution. Now that's something astounding for someone with his background to see and realize. He was very, as in that case, he was very often speaking not just from a personal viewpoint. He was speaking by an inspiration of realization of what the future was going to be like.
What do you think he meant by that? How will women do that? What do you think his vision was?
Well, I think it's by realizing that a view of the human being which comes from the heart, which comes from intuition, is going to be the way that human beings will evolve. And that is happening. That has happened. He was quite right about that. And it's happening more and more.
Okay, thank you. From your encounter and studies, how do you believe Hazrat Inayat Khan viewed the Sufi message in the West in relation to his own Chishti lineage of Sufism?
Well, he saw it as something new. He was very clear about that. He said, Sufism is our mother. We have great honor We give great honor to our mother. We adore our mother. We respect her very deeply, but we are not our mother. He saw what he was doing as a step beyond that. This has always been very difficult for people to accept, particularly people, traditional Sufis, for example, who don't think there's any place beyond where they are. But he was taking a step beyond into a kind of universalism, honoring all of the religions together, having them come together in the universal worship, having people not only appreciate each other, but accept each other fully. And that was his vision for the future, and eventually culminating when the music would become the religion. No, it wouldn't be words anymore, which people will always fight over. It would be music. I wish I were going to live long enough to experience that.
Yes, that's wonderful. Just to follow up on this, there's a question that says, did you find the Quranic teachings under the veil of Murshid's English teachings?
Did I find the Quranic teachings under the veil of Murshid's teachings?
That's the question.
Oh, well, I mean, I've studied the Quran quite extensively. I don't speak Arabic, unfortunately. I know some Persian, but no, I didn't. I would say I'm.
Okay, that's that then.
I remember we were once there was a Murid in our center in Tucson who then went over. There was a mosque that opened by a man named Rashad Khalifa. She went over there and they invited me over once, and we did the Islamic prayers together. And then she asked me, she said, "Well, would you mind leading us in one of Murshid's prayers?" And I asked Rashad Khalifa, "Well, is that all right?" And he said, "Yes." And so I did. I led the group in one of Murshid's prayers, and then afterwards, I said to Rashad Khalifa, the imam of this mosque, I said, "Well, these are something like the Islamic prayers." And he said, to my utter amazement, "Oh yes, but these are much more beautiful."
Well, speaking of the prayers, can you say a little bit about their how they came about and from
Yes. Yes, of course. They came by inspiration. He said they are not the product of a human mind. They came by inspiration as he was putting together the universal worship, which he did in Southampton, in England. He was at a hotel owned by Khalifa Nargis Dowland, and he put together the universal worship. He put Murshida Green, Sophia Sainsbury Green. He put her on retreat for a week in a room, and the prayers came through, and he gave her the prayers. And then at the first universal worship service, which took place in a house in London, he had Murshida Green said the prayers out loud for the first time, and Murshid stood behind her and made the movements that go with the prayers as she was speaking. So that was 1921, in May of 1921.
Those prayers, the lines of them are so living and relevant today. So just open our hearts, hear their voice, and disclose to us the light that we can know and understand life better. It's so direct. It's so absolutely relevant. Many of the lines in those prayers.
Yeah, I think particularly Khatam, which means closing. It was originally called Fatiha, opening, but then he changed the name to Khatam, closing. But especially that prayer, I think, is one instance of the essentialized teachings of Murshid.
One other question, and then I think I'd like to invite you to open this teaching that you feel is the most essential for you, is that to say a little bit about what the followers of Murshid are sometimes accused of being a personality cult, or that we become a little clique, or that we're so devoted to a teacher that others can feel excluded, or you're in or you're out. And this is so different, obviously, than Murshid's message. And so I think it's something to be very aware of. And yet the love and devotion that many have for this teaching creates, I think, can create a problematic dynamic.
Yes, of course that's the case. I mean, the fact is we love Murshid and we love his teaching, and we can't disguise that fact. But it doesn't mean that we belong to some club that other people can't join. And it doesn't mean that, well, when I was living in Europe, I encountered a few people that I came to call Murshid fundamentalists. And it quite surprised me that such people existed. But there were people who would study endlessly what Murshid had taught. And they, of course, loved the complete works because they wanted the authentic, actual thing that he said. And once they had that, they would trot it out and make it into a kind of a rule, you know, a whole series, something like, well, I don't know, like the Catholic Church or Orthodox Judaism or something, all these hundreds of rules that they had for what you could do and what you couldn't do. And it's so exactly opposite to the spirit of Murshid, because Murshid never told people what to do. And he wouldn't have, he wouldn't want to ever do that. And that's one of the things that we love about him. So we can't help loving him, but we can make it clear that if you don't love him, that's all right. And that we're not taking every word that he said as some kind of gospel that we have to obey. That the spirit is, well, it's spiritual liberty. What he taught is spiritual liberty. He left us free. So he was that. He's like a parent or a grandfather to me, I must say. That's one of the ways I think of him. But he's like a grandparent who, you know, wanted to help you to fulfill yourself. He wanted to give you every means possible to make the best of your own life.
Well, yes. I just have to read this last question before we go on. It just came in. It says, would you be willing to speculate on what Hazrat Inayat Khan would have thought about Noor's decision to join the SOE? That's a full question. Maybe everybody doesn't know what that's referring to, but Inayat Khan's oldest child, Noor, during the Second World War,
became a part of English intelligence, radio operator in Paris. When it was time to evacuate her, she was caught by the Nazis and eventually executed in Dachau. Well, I think he feels immensely proud of his daughter. I think he would have understood very well the decision that she made to do that. He, of course, did not tell anyone, not her mother, with whom she was living in London, or her brother Vilayat, who was serving in the Royal Navy. She couldn't tell anybody what she was doing, so she didn't get approval from anybody. But if she had had the chance to ask her father, which she did internally, I feel certain that he would not only have approved of it, but he would feel very, very proud of her sacrifice.
So Sharif would like to share. I'll let you say what what this teaching means to you. We're going to have a photo of Murshid while he reads it, and anything else you'd like to add?
Okay. I'm going to read this talk that Murshid gave in 1922 to a group of Murids. It has the title Attitude. The text will be made available to you, but I didn't want the text on the screen while I'm reading it. I instead want you to just listen to the words with this picture of Murshid, because Murshid says that the reason he gave his teachings orally is because it can go through the ear directly to the heart. And to me, this talk really gives you the very essence, plus a lot of hints about practice, about how to find your way through life. So here we go. There is a well-known saying in Hindustani, if the attitude is solid, the path becomes easy. This is the literal translation. A better translation or interpretation will be a right attitude leads to success. And the more we think of this, the more we shall find in this saying a precious treasure of wisdom. Health, happiness, success, harmony, to all these things in life, the attitude shows the way. Also, if a wrong attitude turns virtues into sin, a right attitude may turn what is called sin by people into virtue. As I have always said, virtue or sin are not actions. It is the attitude that is the condition of virtue or sin. Therefore, have a right attitude. There is no greater virtue than that. Think aright, speak aright, to act aright, and there is sure success. But now comes the question, what is the right of one person is the wrong of another, and what is it that we may call right with authority? I should say, no person must ask another what is right, because no one is capable of telling him, however great, however high in his evolution he may be. But then you say, we may make mistakes. Yes, we learn from our mistakes. If one is afraid of mistakes, he will never learn. It is a matter of courage. Of what use is the virtue learned from others that others tell that is right for you to do? It is of no use. If only you can realize God here, who is living in the heart of man, and no one is closer to us than God, then no one else is capable of telling what is right. Then your God within tells you. If you say, several times I thought something was right, and it turned out wrong in the end, I will say, you were not sure. Perhaps your mind doubted if it were right or wrong. Perhaps you were dependent upon other people's advice. Perhaps preconceived impressions influenced your determination of right and wrong. If it simply came from the bottom of your heart and you accepted it and went on with courage through life, then it would be successful. Or if it met with failure, the failure would become the stepping stone to success. You must remember that God never misleads his followers. Those who follow the advice of the God within are always protected by God. For their affairs, God himself is responsible. Only what is necessary is an open discrimination of what you wish to do. You must ask yourself, is it my real feeling? Is it telling me to do it? Is my sense of justice satisfied with it? Is my reasoning in accordance with it? Is there any conflict with myself, or is it all smooth? If all is smooth within, all is smooth without. The way is open. It is all clear. Then you only have to have faith, trust, and courage to go forward in the strength and goodness of God. And remember, it is not your strength, nor your experiences, nor your knowledge that can give you success. No, it is God. That is what is meant symbolically by the story of Arjuna and Krishna, that when Krishna consented to drive the chariot, Arjuna's heart was free from worry and anxiety. The path was clear because God was with him. It is nothing material which can assure success. Those things give us seeming success. True success is God alone, and all other things added. Remember, therefore, that in a small affair or in a big affair, first, consult yourself and find out if there is no conflict in your own being about anything you want to do. And when you find no conflict there, then feel sure that a path is already made for you. You have but to open your eyes and take a step forward, and the other step will be led. If success appears before you on the horizon, or if it is not yet manifested to your view, in both cases, be sure that constant perseverance, patience, and trust in God will lead you to the fulfillment of your desire. As it is said in the Bible, if you ask for bread, your Father will not give you a stone. In other words, you ask bread because you are meant to have it. It is there for you. If only your attitude is right. If you wish and you ask and you desire to attain something which you think right and just and good. It is difficult for the person who thinks, in order to deserve the bountiful gifts of God, in order to deserve or expect a success in life, one must be worthy. What is man, after all? A child, whatever his age, before God. What are his virtues? Not even a drop compared with the ocean. What can he do to deserve and be worthy? If only he can be natural, think aright, act aright, speak aright, and trust in the love and compassion of God. I think you can see why I think this is such an essential teaching on Murshid's part. And I invite you to develop a practice based on it. I've done that myself, particularly using the breath as a swing going into the heart, going below the surface, the mind, going into the heart deeper and deeper and deeper, and asking the question. It has to be a yes or no question. Shall I do this? Start with small things and work your way to bigger things. But feel then when you get to a very, very deep place in your heart, which will take a few minutes maybe, when you get there, to ask if it's all smooth and to feel the movement of the breath is a swing or a pendulum going. Feel if the movement is all smooth. I've had the experience myself. I've practiced for many years. I've had the experience where I desperately wanted to make a trip to India, but I didn't know if it was the right thing or not. So I asked for a yes or no, and I did practice, and I got to the very depths. And I posed the question, and the pendulum slammed into a brick wall. I gave up the idea of going to India that time. I've been many other times, but you can get a very clear answer from, and that's a great gift in life, to be able to know for sure from the depths of your heart what is the right thing for you to do. That's the voice of God speaking.
And as you said, as you read the paper, to know for sure. And then if it turns out not to be so, that is a step itself towards what is to lead us on.
Right.
That's a lot of pressure to be absolutely sure. But it's very comforting to know that our mistakes lead us to even further knowledge.
Yes, indeed.
So let me see here.
There's something I'd just like to mention before we end, which is that 12 years ago, I gave a two days of talking about Murshid, actually there in Kensington, in Berkeley. Those sessions were all recorded. They're still available on the internet. It's called Tuning the World, and it's on SufiPaths.net. And there are lots and lots of recordings of me talking about Murshid. And 12 years ago, when actually I knew a lot more about him than I do now. I've forgotten a lot of it. I knew back then. But those things are still available. If you can actually stand to listen to me talk on and on. I myself don't find that very appealing, but that's natural enough. But if you want to hear more, it's easily available there. If you just Google Inayat Khan, Sharif Graham, it will come up. Tuning the World on SufiPaths.net.
Thank you. That's wonderful. And we have a chat question here about asking if you're open to email correspondence. There were some questions, details about the archives and Murshid's teaching that we didn't get to. So how would people contact you?
Okay, my email is all lowercase, Sharif, SHARIF, Graham, GRAHAM 11 @gmail.com. It turns out there's another Sharif Graham who already had that email, so I added 11 onto Sharif Graham 11 @gmail.com. And I'd be very, very happy to answer your emails. I always answer them immediately, because if I don't, then I forget about them. So, yes, feel free to write to me if you wish.
Sharif, I think we just scratched the surface here this morning, but it was a wonderful scratch. And
well, we started anyway, and that's great. I haven't had the opportunity to talk about Murshid for some time, and my heart is rejoicing in this opportunity. So thank you so much.
Well, you're very welcome, and thank you everybody for joining in. I'd like to actually read a passage of Murshid's as we come to our closing. I think it's a balancing. The teaching that you read, Sharif, was so important as students on the path, as human beings, to create and find a life of happiness and peace. And this paragraph that I'm going to read is, it's a balancing a message for humanity, for our present time, our planetary evolution, and what might be the place of this message that this man from India over 140 years ago brought to the West. And so here he's speaking. As if out into the universe. The Sufi message is a reminder it's a reminder to humanity, not to any one nation, but to all. Not to one, but every creed. It's a reminder of the truth taught by all the great teachers of humanity, that God, truth, and religion are one, and that duality is only a delusion of human nature. Think then what a great task lies before this message. At this time when nation is against nation, race against race, when the followers of one religion are constantly working against the followers of another, and class against class, competition, hate, prejudice prevailing everywhere. What will be the outcome of it all? What can poison produce? Not nectar, only poison. The message is not for one nation, race, or community. It is for the whole of humanity. And its one and only object is to bring about a better understanding between the divided sections of humanity by awakening their consciousness to the fact that humanity is one family. If one person in the family is ill or unhappy, this must certainly cause unhappiness to the whole family. Yet even this is not the most appropriate simile. Humanity is one body, the whole of life being one in its source and its goal, its beginning and end. And if part of the body is in pain, sooner or later, the whole body is affected. If our finger aches, our body is not free from pain. Thus, no nation, race, or community can be considered as a separate part of humanity. With selfishness as the central theme, the world's progress will never lead to the soul's desire and aim. It must culminate in destruction. At one time, the call was to guard self-interest, but now the moment has come for us to give a message of understanding and consideration for one another. Since individual peace and happiness depend on the peace and happiness of the whole of humanity. Thank you so much. God bless you. And we'll end with the music of Murshid's prayer for the universal. And this is a prayer that speaks of the aspiration that a beautiful temple of understanding may be manifest on earth today, not a physical temple, but with our hearts, a temple of love, harmony, and beauty.
O thou who art the maker, molder, and builder of the universe, build with thine own hands the universe. Our temple for thy divine message of love. message of love, harmony, and beauty. Oh, thou who art the maker, molder, and builder of the universe, build with thine own hands the universe, our temple, for thy divine message of love, harmony, and beauty. O thou who art the maker, molder, and builder of the universe, build with thine own hands the universe, our temple, for thy divine message of love, harmony, and beauty.
We'll unmute the mics now and say goodbye. And again, special thank you, Sharif, for your presence and sharing today. You still retaining a lot there to share with us. So appreciate it. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Gosh, love you.
Thank you, Sharif.
Yay.
Thank you, Sharif.
Thank you, Sharif.
Thank you.
So much. So
Thank
beautiful.
Thank you, Sharif.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. That was
Gosh, love you.
Thank you, Sharif.